Welcome. Cultural rebirth took place throughout 15th century Europe. Some of the most important developments took place in the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Like Italy, renewal in Northern Europe had remarkable art, but arguably, its long-term import came from the printing press and new trends in religious devotion. The most important invention in 15th century Europe was probably the invention of movable type. We generally think of the printing press, but it is movable type that made the printing press capable of doing so much. Central here is Johannes Gutenberg. However, print technology predated Gutenberg. The first printed book was the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist scripture which was published almost 700 years earlier in China. And Europeans had long since developed a rudimentary system for printing that involved carving page-long texts into wood blocks. Gutenberg, however, invented movable metal type. He experimented with how many lines of text he could fit on a page, and the number varied between 36 and 42. He then set each line of text letter by letter. The letters were then inked and pressed upon the page. And so the age of mass printing began, one page at a time. The first book that Gutenberg printed was the Vulgate, that is, the Latin translation of the Bible. A bit of background may be helpful here. The Vulgate came from St. Jerome, who, in the late 4th century, translated the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. The word Vulgate comes from the Latin word vulgus, which means common. It's actually where we get the word vulgar from, although the Latin doesn't have a negative meaning. In the 4th century, Latin was the common language in much of what is now Western Europe, and among Latin-speaking Christians, the Vulgate became the normative Bible translation for more than 1,000 years. The Vulgate was, therefore, the most obvious version of the Bible for Gutenberg to print, although his particular edition is known as the Gutenberg Bible. The initial process of printing was slow, so slow that it probably took 2 years to print just 180 copies of the Gutenberg Bible. Nonetheless, once printed, contemporaries recognized that they were living through a period of monumental technological change. People rapidly saw movable type as a sign of divine favor, especially upon German Christians. But despite his importance, we don't know much about Gutenberg. We know that he died in 1468, but we don't know what he looked like. No portraits of him were painted during his lifetime. We don't even know when he was born. For symbolic reasons, his birth is usually dated to 1400. This aligns his birth with the start of a new century. His invention of movable type is usually then dated to 1450. But here we are on more solid ground, because we have the first surviving report of Gutenberg's Bible in a letter from 1455. After Gutenberg printed the Vulgate, he printed other works too. More people learned how to print, and more books were published. Writings by early Christians were joined by the works of ancient Romans. Classic texts of Christian theology were printed alongside school books and the canon law of the Catholic Church. Through the year 1500, most of this material, perhaps 95%, was printed in Latin. A small amount was also printed in the vernacular, that is, the language of the local population. But at first, print was, like literacy, the preserve of the educated elite. The oldest known illustration of a printing press comes from 1499. It is found in a French work entitled La Grande Danse Macabre, that is, the Great Dance of Death. The image here is from the copy held at the Scheide Library at Princeton University. And frankly, it's remarkable that we even have it. It comes from one of only 2 surviving copies of the work. The other is at the British Library. By the late 14th century, some people feared that Christian devotion was undermined by scholasticism, that is, the academic theology taught in universities. And with the slow but steady rise of cities, some Christians looked to practice their faith in an urban context, especially among the urban poor. One of the most influential movements of religious renewal was found in Northern Europe. It was called the Devotio Moderna. That's Latin for modern-day devotion or the modern-day devout. Some of the ideals of the Devotio Moderna went back more than 1,000 years to the rule of Saint Benedict. Other ideals, such as holding goods in common, went back to the New Testament. The most influential community of the Devotio Moderna was the Brothers of the Common Life. They eventually formed a parallel order for women called the Sisters of the Common Life, and their influence extended across Europe for several reasons. First, in cities, the brothers and sisters ran schools. They were dedicated to educating children, especially orphans. Children therefore learned how to read and write, and this meant that they were more likely to go on to higher university-level education. With a university education, they were more likely to be employed either by the church, by universities, or by royal courts. The Devotio Moderna also produced devotional works. You may have heard of Thomas à Kempis. He's best known for his work the Imitatio Christi, or the Imitation of Christ. It is believed that after the Bible, the Imitation is the most translated book in human history. It was also the most popular book in all of Europe between 1420, when it was completed, and the mid-17th century. Early on, it was copied by hand. Later, it was printed and translated into every European language. Here we see pages from the first edition of the Imitation of Christ, which was published in early 1473. Over the next 2 centuries, more than 1,500 editions were produced. The Imitation of Christ emphasized some very traditional themes. One was Bible reading. On the one hand, the Bible had always been important, but with the arrival of movable type, the Bible was increasingly available, and with more texts produced every year, literacy also grew. Because the Imitation of Christ was so popular, its emphasis on the Bible reinforced both literacy and the increased reading of the Bible. A second theme is devotional focus upon the sufferings of Jesus. This illustration from 1492 is an excellent example. In the 15th century, devotion increasingly focused on Jesus' personal sacrifice on behalf of all people. The technical term here is Christocentric, that is, focused on Christ. Christocentric devotion also underscored Jesus' humanity and the Christian belief that Jesus shares in human suffering as well. With the growth of the printing press, this very traditional idea was given new immediacy, and no book helped with this more than the Imitation of Christ. Finally, Kempis had a unique view of the Christian ritual of Holy Communion, which is also known as the Eucharist, the Mass, and the Lord's Supper. The Imitation of Christ has 4 books, but the last book is entirely about communion. In fact, sometimes the 4th book of the Imitation circulated on its own as an independent devotional work. For Kempis, receiving communion was a key act of piety, and in this he was very traditional. But he was a bit less traditional in claiming that Christians should not speculate about the Eucharist. This was probably a dig at the scholastics, who wrote a lot of academic theology on point. Kempis instead emphasized the necessity of personal faith. Christians only received communion rightly when they did so in faith. For Kempis, piety came first. All else was secondary. There's another reason why the Devotio Moderna was influential. The greatest biblical scholar in 16th century Europe was Erasmus of Rotterdam. He was an orphan, educated in one of the schools run by the Brothers of the Common Life. As an adult, Erasmus published a wide variety of books, many of which were quite influential. Some were works of Christian devotion, and like Kempis, Erasmus's writings were Christocentric. He called his theology the philosophy of Christ, and again, like Kempis, Erasmus was often negative towards scholasticism. One of his most important works was the Novum Instrumentum, a bilingual New Testament published in 1516. The Greek text was on the left, and its Latin translation on the right. Portraits of Erasmus might not look especially interesting, but contemporaries saw him as a larger-than-life figure. He was often shown sitting at a desk with his books. However, This was a pose most often associated with Saint Jerome, the same Jerome who, as we already saw, gave Latin-speaking Christians the Vulgate Bible. In order to better understand portraits of Erasmus, let's look a bit more at how Saint Jerome was traditionally portrayed. There's no shortage of examples, some of them quite remarkable. Consider this picture, Saint Jerome in his study, which was painted around 1435 by the remarkable Jan van Eyck, one of the greatest painters in Northern Europe. 40 years later, we have the same title for a very similar painting, this one by Antonello da Messina. Less sophisticated forms of visual art, such as this illustration in the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493, also show Jerome at his desk. And even in the 17th century, Caravaggio painted his remarkable portrait, which is known both as Saint Jerome writing and Saint Jerome in his study. Returning now to the 16th century, as Erasmus worked on the Greek New Testament, he came to recognize that the Vulgate could be improved. After all, no translation is perfect. His Novum Instrumentum was intended to show where the Latin could be improved. So, for those living at the time, Erasmus was like a new Jerome, and paintings of him, seated at his desk like Jerome, sought to communicate exactly this. In two famous portraits, both from 1523, Hans Holbein portrayed Erasmus in the same way. Holbein didn't call his painting something like Erasmus in his study because the posture itself was a kind of argument. When Erasmus published his Greek New Testament, he did something unusual, but it was not entirely new. Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, a Catholic cardinal and Archbishop of Toledo, Spain, began working on a polyglot Bible in 1502. The word polyglot simply means many languages. This remarkable new Bible contained texts in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. They were placed side by side, as seen here. The work eventually encompassed 6 volumes, which were printed between 1514 and 1517. Compiling ancient biblical texts, written in diverse languages, thus became a major scholarly activity. And as time went on, polyglot Bibles became larger. For example, in 1657, the Anglican bishop Brian Walton published the London Polyglot. The front cover of the London Polyglot, seen here, advertises 9 languages. And here is Walton, portrayed much like Saint Jerome and Erasmus. 16th century Catholic biblical scholarship, especially that of Cisneros and Erasmus, laid the foundation for all later Bible translations. So what? There are so many so whats in all that we've just looked at. For now, I'm just going to focus on one, and that is the afterlife of Johannes Gutenberg. Quite obviously, movable type and the printing press were profoundly transformative. Print enabled the dissemination of new editions of old biblical texts in a wide variety of languages. Print also helped disseminate new devotional trends like that found in Kempis and Erasmus. More than one book has been written about a Gutenberg revolution. Some have gone so far as to describe Gutenberg as the man of the millennium. Still others have described Gutenberg's movable type as the most important invention of the last 1,000 years. Even if this seems overblown, Gutenberg has long been a celebrated figure. Here we see an American stamp from 1950 that celebrates the 500th anniversary of Gutenberg printing the Bible. Our own age of electronic media does not prevent us from appreciating Gutenberg. Without movable type, we wouldn't have newspapers or magazines, and we wouldn't have books either. But Gutenberg has also been adapted to the electronic era. For example, there is the website Project Gutenberg, which contains free scans of thousands of texts. It's probably impossible to overstate Gutenberg's importance. And that is a very big so what. First, I thank the Bridwell Library Special Collections at Southern Methodist University for allowing me to reproduce images from their online exhibits of the Imitation of Christ. I again thank the British Library for general permission to republish images from their collection. And I thank the Piety Library at Princeton University for permission to reproduce the image from La Grande Danse Macabre, other than darkening the page from the Gutenberg Bible for the sake of contrast. I made no changes to these images. I've linked each library in the description below, and I encourage you to look at their online holdings. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First is Stefan Fussel's volume simply entitled Gutenberg. Clearly written and brilliantly illustrated, it's the most up-to-date study of Gutenberg available in English. Next is John Van Engen's wonderfully engaging study, Sisters and Brothers of the Common Life, the Devotio Moderna, and the World of the Later Middle Ages. Van Engen is the leading English-language scholar of the Devotio Moderna. Finally, Cornelius Augustine's volume, Erasmus, Life, Works, and Influence, strikes a fine balance between scholarship and approachability. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time. There's no hidden scene this time. Not one.